society. Now, before we do anything, I'd like to make a few announcements, or just one. Next week, on the 14th of February, that's Valentine's Day, so you won't forget, we're having a very unique concert at the Siam Society. We're bringing 3 Dutchmen with their 16th century replica instruments, the recorders, and they're going to be playing 16th century music, including one piece by Henry VIII. So please do join us next week. Now, I just want to say that it's absolutely, I'm so delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, who's a very, very good, old and good friend, Patricia Welch. Patricia and I first met, they told me now it's 35 years ago, at a museum volunteers lecture at the museum. And we had all just returned from holidays. And she came to me waving this letter and said, "Are you Eileen Dealey? You know, I wrote to you, why didn't you answer me?" Well, remember, those days we only had postal mail, you know, I was on holiday. So I said, yes. She said, "I want to join all these activities with the, museum." And she had a long list of, her CV looks absolutely brilliant, but we had no time to look at it because the lecture was about to start. So I said, "Well, you're so wonderful. Can you run a slide projector?" Also, these were the pre-digital days, right? And she said, yes. So I said, okay, there it is, go and run it then. That was the first step for her, and she had never stopped and never looked back since. For her 2-year stay here with her husband Matthew at the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, she participated in everything the museum volunteers had to offer. She went on every trip, she attended the lectures, she was a guide at the museum. Wonderful. Okay, and she was soaking up all the art and culture of, and history of Thailand and the neighboring countries. It was wonderful. So in 1995, they moved to Singapore, but she still continued her fervent study and research on the things she loved. This is Asian art, history, and philosophy and religion. Now, she set up the manual for the docents training program at the Asian Art Civilizations Museum. She herself is a wonderful guide. I've been on several tours with her because she's so passionate in bringing people to the museum and make sure that they understand what they're seeing and appreciate all the things there. So it's wonderful. She's also a lecturer at many famous institutions, including the Siam Society. Patricia has 5 books published, including the definitive opus on Chinese art motifs and visual imagery. Now, this was published in 2007 by Tuttle and has remained to this day most valuable and indispensable to anyone who wants to study about art motifs and also the stories behind each motif. Okay, since the year of the rooster, that was back in 2017, Patricia has been coming annually, every year, to the Siam Society to give a lecture on the zodiac animal that will be presiding over the forthcoming Chinese New Year. This year is the year of the dragon, and it will begin the Chinese New Year on Saturday, the 10th of February. So please join me to welcome Patricia Welch to the podium for her lecture, Here Be Dragon.
Thank you, Eileen. We spoke on the telephone. I said, keep it short and sweet, Eileen. Okay, anyway, very, very nice. Thank you. I'm slightly overwhelmed. Those of you who have come to hear your fortune for the year, you're going to be very disappointed. I do not do astrology or fortunes. I do strictly art history. But this was a fun year. I thought it wasn't going to be the dragon, but I really enjoyed doing the research for it. So let's see if you enjoy or get as much information out of this as I've learned. So everyone recognizes the dragon as one of the best-known symbols, right, representing China and Chinese culture. But what is its origin? And what's the nature of the dragon? And how has the Chinese dragon been depicted throughout history? And the answers, as you will soon see, are as varied as the elements that compose the dragon. The famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung once ventured the thought that the dragon's origin might be mankind's memory of some prehistoric flying lizard, preserved in the collective unconscious of the human race. I read that to my husband, and he said, "Are you kidding?" He said, "There weren't people around when there were flying dinosaurs." But as I began to do the research on this topic, I understood exactly what Carl Jung meant, and I think you will too, because dragons seem to be everywhere. Any place you looked, I found dragons. In ancient Babylonian and Mesopotamian mythology, for example, there's a female monster named Tiamat, who's identified with salt water, who, upon cohabitating with Apsu, who is the personification of fresh water, begets and gives birth to a whole bevy of small gods. But after a while, she and Apsu are disturbed by the noise of these younger gods, and they decide to destroy them. Okay? She's reluctant, nevertheless, half of them are slain. And at this point, Marduk, who's described at this point as just a strong hero, appears, and he slays her. And he splits her body in two, and he fixes half of it up in the heavens to oversee and take care of the water in the atmosphere. And Marduk at this time then becomes chief of all the gods and the city of Babylon. And he subdues the remaining gods. He turns Tiamat into a pacified ally, and then he turns to organize the universe and establish the calendar, which is, of course, the most important part of ancient society, is getting that calendar established. And the point of this whole story is how order overcomes and does away with chaos. Variations of this tale you're going to find throughout all of our studies of the dragon. And those of you who grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, anybody here who grew up? Okay, maybe you have children who played Dungeons and Dragons. You should know the name Tiamat because it's a major character in the game Dungeons and Dragons. You may have seen even some of these rubbings of Marduk and the subdued Tiamat from this period because she is usually depicted at his feet. And although these dragons only vaguely resemble the Chinese dragon, whose year we're celebrating this year, note and remember, please, the reptilian heads and the distinctive horns you're seeing on these Babylonian dragons. A single horn only on the one on the Ishtar gate, but originally two horns on the earlier steely rubbings, because these are going to remain as identifying marks of the dragon as we see it progress through history. In Mesoamerica, we have the Aztec feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl. This is a really hard name, Quetzalcoatl, described as the embodiment of the creative force, who's essential not only with providing rain, but also fertility and agriculture, and is also associated with wisdom. As a feathered serpent, which suggests the union of both earth and the sky, who is usually associated with big eyes, snout, and fangs, I kept looking at this. This is part of the display we have on now in Singapore with our Manila Galleon exhibition. And every time I looked at these carvings, I thought, gosh, they look sort of dragon-like, don't they? So by what you've heard so far, you can understand why the scholar Mircea Eliade says, well, all dragons are emblems of water, with both positive and negative elements, storms as well as spring rains, destruction as well as fertility. They're male, they're female. And so it's perhaps not that strange that we find that the depictions of dragons are incredibly large as a topic and inconsistent at the very best. My screen is not moving. Let's see, this will do it. Now, you probably know St. George and the Dragon, who's credited with slaying the dragon who's threatening the life of a princess. The dragon represents paganism, and the story obviously symbolizes Christianity's overcoming of pagan beliefs. But here in Asia, we do not slay our dragons. We like dragons, and we recognize that dragons can be tamed, and they can even be used for the good, because we've all watched Game of Thrones on Netflix, haven't we? So in trying to understand the nature of dragons, it's essential to distinguish between the historical accounts, the religious texts, the mythological stories we hear, and of course, all the symbolic stories. With so many dragons, my focus for the rest of this talk and for the next 45 minutes is going to be purely on the nature, roles, and depictions of Chinese dragons. So we start with a very unique text. This is known as the Shanhai Jing, which translated means guideways through mountains and seas. It was compiled sometime between the 4th and the 1st century BC, and in it we find about 600 names of gods, heroes, demons, and strange creatures, including dragons. And I've put a list of just some of the more prominent dragons mentioned on the slide for you. This book depicts a geography that is filled with strikingly unusual inhabitants. And it's an amazing book to read. You'll probably find a copy here in our library. And while several gods mentioned are associated with dragons, no gods are specifically paired off with specific dragons, like Marduk was with the dragon Tiamat. For example, the Shanhai Jing talks about a god named Rusho, and you see a drawing of Rusho on the right. He's said to like to ride on 2 dragons. He's described as having a human face, white hair, tiger claws, and a snake that lives in his left ear, which you can just begin to see on this diagram. So in China, this is usually the role that our dragons take. They are steeds. They're the mounts that our gods and our mortals ride on. They are not associated or paired off with heroes. Another note to make is that in China, we don't find those god-animal hybrids, nor deities with animal heads on godlike bodies, as we find in ancient Egypt and other geographies. Although there was a short period in Chinese history when some of the tomb figurines did depict the 12 zodiac animals dressed as Chinese Confucian classical scholars with animal heads, that fashion died out after only about 100 years. So in China, the dragon is the only imaginary animal in the entire zodiac lineup. The other 11 are very real animals indeed. So let's try to track down China's early dragons. Our oldest evidence, written evidence, dates back to the Shang Dynasty. This is China's Neolithic period, when the term appears in divination inscriptions. And on the right, you see how the character evolved over time with the classical version on the right. By the latter part of the Shang, there are a number of animal designs that had become part of the Shang repertoire, with members from both the natural and the supernatural worlds. But it's on these tortoise shells, excuse me, that we find our earliest written references to a dragon. This is one of my favorite early Shang inscriptions showing a dragon, because it shows a child, a dragon, and what scholars have identified as human hands at the bottom of the drawing. And what you should note is the dragon's gaping mouth, the up-curled snout, the large eye, and the horn. Its meaning here seems to imply that it's not only a creature connected with clouds and rain, but by the addition of that child, fertility. But what were dragons really supposed to look like? So I found a text called the Shuowen, which is an ancient Chinese dictionary compiled during the Eastern Han Dynasty. So that's about 25 to 206 CE. And it describes dragons as having the head of a scaled reptile, sometimes dark, sometimes bright, sometimes small, sometimes big, sometimes short, sometimes long. Not very helpful. But the single, excuse me, I've been talking too much to all of you before we started. But the single attribute that all dragons have across all cultures is that they are all symbols of extraordinary power and energy. So here's a chart of rubbings from a variety of Shang and Zhou dynasty bronzes that scholars believe depict ancient dragons. And from looking at them, you can understand why some early scholars thought that dragons originated in the ancient worship of snakes, alligators, and nature. And when some old bone carvings were discovered in 1899 in Hunan province, which looked very reptilian, they were first identified as Zhou dynasty representations of the Chinese alligator. Additionally, the character for rain appears on 3 of the 6 carvings. together with the character for dragon, the actual character lung, on 2 of the pieces. And since the inscriptions that could be deciphered also contained the text, "The king inquired as to the omens," researchers conclude that these carvings had been used for divination. In fact, they resembled so closely the Western Zhou bronze ornaments that you see here, which date from the same time period, that scholars had also identified as representations of the Chinese alligator, that I had to contact an alligator specialist. And he told me that historical and archaeological evidence does suggest that alligators were present in ancient China during this period. The species Alligator sinensis is native to China. It was found in the Yangtze River basin, and when compared to the ancient depictions of dragons, the similarity is really quite striking, at least I think so. Apparently, they grew up to 5 to 7 feet in length, and they were even supposedly mentioned by Marco Polo in his famous travel log. ChatGPT confirmed their mention when I queried it, but not specifically in the Yangtze River area, and then it warned me that Marco Polo's travelogue was not a reliable source. But if we look really closely at this chart of the development, the evolution of the Chinese dragon, you begin to notice that one of the pictograms resembles those nephrite jade dragons with the big eyes, the long snout, and that flowing mane that so many museums pride themselves on collecting, the ones known as Hongshan or C-shaped dragons. And they're recognized by some scholars as metaphoric images, probably worn as amulets to enlist animal powers to protect and benefit their human wearers, since they were usually found in tombs on or round the chest of the deceased. And many scholars believe they collectively provide a prototype for the Chinese dragon as we know it today. Moreover, scholars agreed that these nephrite jade figures represented a considerable investment of time and resources for the civilization that made them. And when we have such repeating recognizable forms in what appear to be standardized proportions, it is always significant. It means that they were the products of an organized group of people made for a specific purpose at a specific time. An exciting discovery in Inner Mongolia, unearthed by archaeologists only last year, was a 20-centimeter long figure formed from mussel shells, complete with a head, body, and details, which they have concluded is an early representation of a dragon. I know it's very hard to tell from the picture that they provided in China News, and which some are saying may date back even earlier than those C-shaped dragons made of jade. But another theory, and this is the one that I think sounds more realistic, is that this may have been the way that the commoners, or people in the words of the Chinese archaeologist, those living in low-grade settlements, worshipped or depicted dragons, whereas those beautiful jade sea dragons may have been made by and belonged to the settlement's elite or royalty. The timing is exactly right. These are the 2 most common types of sea dragons. The smaller one is the jade pig dragon, because it supposedly has a pig-like head, and the larger outer jade is known as the sea dragon, because of its slimmer, oval sea shape. Its head also has a slimmer snout, but note that protuberance on its head. So a lot of people say, oh no, dragons obviously come from snakes. But how do you explain that protuberance on the head of this figure if it's supposed to be a snake? I've never seen a snake with anything like that, right? An interesting side note, because I know some of you are going to be going to the Philippines next month. While these carvings have mainly been found in graves in China, a large number of them have also been found in the Philippines, where it's believed that they were used as fish net sinkers, tied to nets. That's the little pig-headed one. And in the case of the larger sea dragon, they were used as stone fishing hooks, because the shape, once swallowed by a fish, would have been nearly impossible to dislodge. So I'm going to ask those of you who are going on this Philippines trip, when you go to museums, would you please keep an eye out? I'd be very curious to know if you actually find any of these, as the scholars say, they have found in the Philippines. Now let's look at that little protuberance above the head of this creature, which at first glance might appear to be a snake, but that is the reason why it has not been identified as a snake, but is the oldest representation of a dragon found to date in China, because of this bowl, one of only 4 of its type that has been found. It's on display for the first time in China. I discovered it only a week ago in the Year of the Dragon special exhibition at the Shanxi Museum. It was unearthed from an archaeological site about 20 years ago, but the Chinese are very careful in how they share their archaeological and historical finds and information. They like to save it up and then sort of drip feed it out. And it was very hard for me to find any more information about this. So I discovered that this was actually a site excavated 20 years ago, and there was one other interesting item that was dug up with it in the same graveyard that was not mentioned in the article that talks about this current exhibition, and that was they found a drum, and the skin of that drum was an alligator skin. You can read the description yourself about this amazing bowl. If you look at that coiled snake, the first time I looked at this, I thought, oh, a snake? But look at that protuberance on the head. And those flames, or whatever is coming out of the creature's mouth, as the text says, that's supposed to represent good things being offered to the people, the blessings of the dragon. But the Shang dynasty falls to nomadic invaders from the north, and we all know what happens when one culture comes and moves in on another culture. Things change, there's influences. And this marks the founding of the Zhou dynasty with the falling of the Shang, and that change exerted a profound influence on Shang China, including its art forms. And amongst them, it introduced a whole new array of bronze representations of animals that included winged birds. And the mention of wings is very, very interesting, because it's during the Zhou dynasty, according to Bernhard Karlgren, who's one of the greatest, unfortunately he's passed away, Swedish sinologists, that the dragon takes on its identifiable Chinese form, becoming an emblem of the masculine power of active creation, a creature who's limitless in power and thus dwells in a multiple of environments, mountains, lakes, rivers for sure, but now we add the sky. These Zhou dynasty dragons commanded both heaven and earth, descending into the waters at the autumnal equinox and at the vernal equinox, rising and ascending into the sky, which is exactly the calendrical cycle of the Mesoamerican feather serpent I introduced to you earlier, Quetzalcoatl. Exactly the same calendar cycle. The association of dragons with the heavens and earth, power, wind, and water has even entered the world of Chinese idioms. Do you know what the traditional phrase is used in Chinese to describe a tornado? It's the wind whirled by a dragon, Lung Juan Feng. And because dragons are seen as the rulers of moving bodies of water, such as rivers and waterfalls, I think it's important to remember how many Chinese rivers actually contain the word for dragon. Here's the list, starting with the Black Dragon River, Heilongjiang. And since I live in Singapore, of course we cannot forget our Prime Minister's name, Li Hsien Loong, which means auspicious dragon, Li. But back to the historical evolution of the dragon. The larger picture depicts an Eastern Zhou dragon pendant. Now note how the face has further developed with more pronounced jaws. The Zhou was followed by a 300-year transitional period known as the Spring and Autumn period that finally ends up in the Warring States period, which was a period exactly like it sounds like. It was a period of warring states. The looped dragon you see is from this period. It still retains the elongated form. It has an open mouth. The face has definitely developed, and the protuberance above the head, yep, it's there. This unusual bronze figure is dated to the Warring States period. You can see it today. It's in the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, where it was identified as a bronze winged dragon. But it's clearly based upon a war horse. The timing, the period is right. It's an oddity at best. Other things were happening during this dynasty as well, and some of the great philosophical schools of China are developing, so all sorts of new ideas are coming into play. The Warring States period ends with a very short-lived period called Qin, this period that unified China, which was followed by the famous period of relative stability that we know as the Han. And by this period, even the school of Confucianism now is formed, it's moving along. And what is Confucianism's concerned with? Orderliness, taking chaos and making order of it in the world. The Han even credits its founder, one of the greatest unifiers in Chinese history, the Emperor Gaozu, as having been fathered by a dragon. The story goes that while his mother lay asleep dreaming, the sky darkens into a storm, and when Gaozu's father goes to look for his wife, he sees a scaly dragon hovering over the place where she was lying. And after this, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to Liu Bang, who of course becomes the Emperor Gaozu. Now, note that this drawing is not from this period. This is from a very famous 13th century scroll by an artist called Chen Rung. So it's not how dragons were depicted during the Han Dynasty. I just thought it looked like a dragon who might have fathered the Emperor Gaozu, so I have it here to give you an interesting picture. During the early Han, many of the most important Chinese cosmological ideas that had been germinating for years become codified by a scholar named Liu An. And what he does is try to organize the world as it's known to create an ethical harmony of all things, following the Confucian basic teachings. So based on the 5 basic substances of water, metal, wood, fire, and earth, he makes a new chart. This had tremendous impact upon the way Chinese culture began to re-perceive its world. Each of those elements was represented by a color, a direction, and an animal that even included the dragon. Now, Liu An was also the first to add central as a cardinal direction, so it could be assigned to the emperor, which I think was a very shrewd career move, if ever there was one. But for us, the important thing to note is that the dragon is not assigned to the black and to the water and to the north. It's assigned to the eastern quadrant. It becomes known as the green dragon of the east. We now associate the dragon with a more gentle terrain, from winter to spring, emphasizing fertility, new growth, and the color green, keeping the snake and the water and the black separated off up to the north, the associations being very obvious. And these 4 animals were known as the Siling, or the 4 spirits. And just as sages were to exert moral authority over human beings, these 4 animals were supposed to rule and influence their respective domains to ensure the success of the reigning dynasty. So as such, they played a major symbolic role in formal communication to ensure that orderly society and court and military behavior followed suit. It even dictated which animals should be displayed on troop flags and banners. For example, when marching around lakes and marshes, armies were supposed to show a dragon banner. And when you were marching in the mountains, then you displayed a wolf banner. Tallies, I think you've probably seen some of these in Chinese museum collections. These were metal tokens that were made in matched pairs, and one would be given to a subordinate and the other to his superior, the person to whom he reports. And whenever an order was given, the tally went with it. So if a subordinate appears and presents a tiger tally, the general pulls out his, they match, and the directions from the emperor are followed. Yes, you attack. Yes, you retreat, or whatever. So this was a major factor in the development of these animals and the impact they played. You see these 4 directions on this Han Dynasty bronze mirror. This is in my museum, Asian Civilizations Museum up in Singapore. We have a Tang period shipwreck called the Belitung, It's so far the earliest shipwreck of its age found in these Southeast Asian waters. You have a similar ship found off the coast of southern Thailand, but our shipwreck also contained 60,000 pieces of ceramics, which were very helpful in dating the shipwreck, whereas the shipwreck, or the ship that was found off the Thai coast, they believe was abandoned and was left as a wreck. It was found in a fish farm, which had now moved about 2 kilometers inland, but they're still examining and looking at that wreck today. Anyway, if you look at the bronze mirror on the left, you see that it depicts 2 of the original 4 directional animals, the tiger and, of course, the dragon. But the one on the right, which is a later Tang dynasty, so 618 to 907, this bronze mirror depicts all 4 of those animals. And the acceptance of the siling, these 4 animals, where the dragon represents the season of spring, wood, green, just underscores its shift into that train of more benevolent, life-generating forces. And I think would have been a major factor in launching the dragon on its career as the most prolific symbol in Chinese art. China's large northern and western land borders also allowed cross-border influences to enter with periodic waves. And this confronting dragon and phoenix design is an excellent example of how steppe art influenced Chinese motifs during this period. And it's a hint of which we saw earlier during the Warring States period. Look at that Han Dynasty disc. A lot of people look at this, they never recognize the phoenix, so I've labeled it for you. The dragon is arranged in an S shape, and remember, it's developed out of that 8th to 5th century BC round dragon shape that we looked at. But it's during the Han that dragons become more family associated, more fertility. To have fertility, you have to have a female counterpart. And so we think that this edition came probably from that steppe influence. And now we have the bird kingdom, not overtly, but symbolically portrayed along with the dragon. It's very subtle. But here are some more early examples found in the western region in Xinjiang. And look at these forms with new eyes. We always looked at that jade dragon on the right as maybe being paws or flames or something of that sort. But having seen that former piece now, you can see why scholars are beginning to think this may have been the first sign of the addition of the phoenix into the dragon-phoenix combination. So I don't know how you would interpret that ambiguous jade figure on the right, but feathers, claws, the dragon's own claws, who knows? I think it's very interesting. And what's happening, though, in other parts of China are totally different forms of dragons. Did geography play a role, we have to ask ourselves? Because a few hundred years later, we find this, slimmer, streamlined dragons, much more snake-like in bronze. This example comes from the Turkic Northern Wei dynasty, a period during which China was ruled by those northern tribes again. And we've lost any of that alligator look because, of course, we're now talking about dry northern plains, tribal ideas with their own cultural and aesthetic ideals. And note that the dragon's also lost its wings, which had been another influence, but it hasn't lost its ability to fly, as you're going to see soon. So this is a new theory. Perhaps it was due to all of these varying depictions that during the Han, the dragon began to be described as consisting of 9 composite animals with various renditions. The muzzle of a camel, the horns of a deer, the eyes of a bull, a body like a snake, a belly like a crab or a clam, scales like a carp, claws like a hawk, eyes like a demon, paws like a tiger. And this was not the only list. There are a number of variations on such lists. But the rationale of all of them seemed to be that by combining the qualities of all of these animals, the dragon is accorded powers that move between heaven, earth, and the cosmic oceans. Only the number 9 remains constant on these lists. And why? Because the Chinese considered it the perfect number. It's 3 times 3. It evokes infinity, and partly because the basic 3 are heaven, earth, and mankind. And as we know, in later Chinese art, it's also a homophone, which sounds like another character that has the meaning of forever. So the number 9 is always significant. It seems that everyone's familiar with the term dragon robe when describing an emperor's clothing, but they aren't as old as we think they are. There's only one reliable source to dragons as the principal design on robes dating from the Tang Dynasty. So that's 618 to 907 CE. And then there's no further mention of dragon robes until the 10th century, when it was reported that the first emperor of the Sung Dynasty presented an imperial robe with coiled dragons worked in pearls to one of his officers. And this seems to be the only reference to the presentation of a dragon robe in that dynasty. Although there was another dictate saying that dragon patterns were forbidden to all subjects in the same year, with the exception of the emperor and the empress. Moreover, we don't have a single portrait of an emperor or an empress of the Sung dynasty that shows a robe with a dragon pattern. So although there's a lot of talk about dragon robes, it's not obvious how important they were in the early years. And it's become a very specialized study of its own that requires a lot of time. So if you're interested in the topic, Schuyler Kamen was the first scholar who wrote the definitive book on China's dragon robes. It was written in 1952. It's still the place to begin if you're interested in this subject. However, just in the last 15 years, we have had so much more information. And why? More tombs have been discovered. A lot of the robes that were in private collections, because they went there in the early 1800s, have now come out of those private collections, handed down through families that are selling them to raise money, and so we are getting more and more of these robes available through auctions and private deals. So between archaeology and collections, and also museums are beginning, there's so much talk about things disappearing from museums. A lot of museums are beginning to go through their archives again and start looking at what they actually have. And they are finding, I'm told by one friend in China, they're finding robes they forgot that they had. So we're going to have a lot more research in the next few years. Reference works will tell you how many claws should be on which dragons of which period, what textiles and trims and accessories you could wear with which robe, etc. So there's a lot of information for anyone who's interested. But I want to return to the Sung Dynasty, because this was a period known for the flourishing arts. And here we begin for the first time to find dragons as a very fashionable subject for painters. Now, I already showed you one painting, or one part of this painting by Chen Rung, this 13th century literati artist. It's a very famous, very huge painting called 9 Dragons. Here's another section from that same scroll, and note the details: the shape of the head, the horns, the scales, and the claws. Although monochrome ceramics were the most prized ceramics of the Sung, that's exactly this period, we begin now for the first time to find dragon designs on ceramics. Not that early one, obviously those disappeared. The Neolithic one I showed you of the coiled, what looked like a snake with a protuberance on the head. But there had really been a dearth of dragon designs on ceramics, and that's because it was the monochromes. The early Chinese pots were not highly decorated. There might be a few etchings on them, but it wasn't until they really began, some of the kilns, to work with different glazes and techniques that you find decorations on them. And during the Sung, there was a group of kilns in the north that did not focus on making monochromes, but instead they had been producing a very distinctive type of ceramics that featured dark and underglazes, incised or carved with designs. This was Suzhou wares. But the Mongol invasions that ended the Sung caused many of these artisans from these northern kilns to flee to the south, and they brought their technique and the idea of dragons with them to the south. And there they were very close geographically to the kilns of Jingdezhen. And the belief now by scholars of early blue and white Chinese ceramics is it was this technique from the north with these fleeing potters that introduced this new style that creates eventually the very famous ceramics we know as blue and white dragon ceramics of China. But before we leave this slide, I want you to look at those brush holders on the bottom right. They're beautiful. They're made out of brass or bronze, and very, very collectible. And you do begin to find more and more of these coming out again of private collections. But what you see on the left is the 14th century Yuan Dynasty Suzhou style jar featuring a dragon. It looks more like an oversized shrimp, I know, but just use your imagination. It's going to turn into a dragon. And what we see it developing into only 50 years later is such beautiful blue and white pots as these. The Sung falls to the Mongols in 1279. The dynasty that we know as the Yuan was born. It was strongly influenced by the North. They loved the color white. It was their religious color. And they loved these new blue and white ceramics. And this is a time when cobalt is beginning to be discovered in China, etc., etc. These ceramics were followed by the Ming, which is well known as the classic era of blue and white Chinese porcelain, with the dragon emerging as one of the most popular designs, inspired in part by all of those Sung Dynasty paintings that the artist had been doing. And on the right, you see the most famous dragons known to ceramic scholars. They appear as the central motif on this pair of vases. These are the oldest dated blue and white ceramics discovered so far. We're on the verge, we hope, of discovering some even older ones. The date on them is 1351, and it's inscribed in that inscription on the top of the jar. It's part of a set that was made for a temple, and the date was inscribed on it. If you visit the British Museum, they're part of the Sir Percival David collection. You can see them in the British Museum. And this is one of the finest examples ever found of a late Ming blue and white dragon plate. And it's in a private collection in Singapore. And if any of you come and visit Singapore, the owner would be delighted to share it with other ceramic enthusiasts. It was miraculously produced during a period when there was actually even a decline in ceramic production at Jingdezhen, in part because this emperor's period of rule was marked by all sorts of problems with patronage and support and political pressures, and so he stopped supporting the Jingdezhen kilns. This is where they had to turn to other markets and began mass producing for export. But this plate shows three of the most extremely beautiful pairs of dragons floating in rui shapes that I think you'll ever see. Now, earlier I mentioned that dragons were described as being a composite of 9 different animal characteristics. But with so many variations, another classification appeared. This one identified 9 different types of dragons, grouped by function, in other words, how they were depicted or used. And they became popularly known as the dragon's sons. And the first, usually referred to as the oldest son, was known as Bjaaland. And he was described as the dragon found supporting pillars or steles or columns. And obviously it represents the mythical tortoise who was believed to support the world on its back. And you'll see these all over China as you travel. It was the standard foundation of steles. The second of the group of 9 was called Shuowen. This was the hornless dragon who was said to like to swallow things. And the character wen once meant the lips on an animal's mouth, which is why it's called the Shuowen. This is a very fish-like, hornless dragon found along rooftops that was supposed to safeguard buildings from fires. And you'll see this on various buildings as you travel around China, also in the Forbidden City. And we're going to come back to him in just about 5 minutes. And the third was Putao, the dragon who is said likes to roar. And he appears on bell handles, usually with 2 heads affixed to one bell, with a curved body forming the handle. The fourth was called Bjaaland, and is depicted above courts of law and prison doors, the face only, never a body. The face most resembles a tiger with 2 large bared fangs. And number 5, we go back to the Taotia, the oldest face that we know, found on ancient bronzes. The 6th was identified as the dragon that appears decorating bridges and overpasses and piers. And again, it's only the head and a little part of the neck that's shown. The 7th is identified as the face that decorated axe handles. The 8th was the flat, round face that was found supporting door handles and door guards. And the 9 was said to be found atop incense burners because he preferred to sit still and just smell sweet smells. However, consult another list and you find it varies. And a recent search that I made found another list that included the dragon carved on the screws of fiddles. I tried to find a picture for you, but I couldn't, but someone found something. Another category which was listed was the dragons found carved on Buddha's throne. Again, I had a hard time finding an example. If anyone knows a Buddha's throne with a dragon, not an alligator or a crocodile, let me know. And one mischievous person took the dragon stele, and there's always a dragon or a tortoise supporting the bottom, but at the top there's usually a plaque with 2 dragons at the top, and they separated the top dragon off and decided that that should be a dragon of its own category. But as many of you are probably already thinking, because we are in Southeast Asia, aren't we? Aren't these 9 types of dragons just sort of variations of those mythical creatures that we see borrowed from other cultures in our neighborhood? And they very well could have been. The Makara, for example, of ancient Indian tales, is the most frequently mentioned candidate for having been plagiarized and parts moved into the dragon. Could it be that that original elephant trunk of the Makara has been shortened and got reinterpreted as a horn on the dragon? There are many who believe this is exactly what happened. And doesn't that early jade carving of a dragon on the upper right sort of look like an early prototype of the dragon that we now identify as a Chinese Shuowen, the fish-like dragon that now sits on roofs to guard against fires? But then how do we explain this 4th century painting that clearly shows a Makara together with what are described as dragons? Now this is quite a large painting, and the scene shows the goddess of the Luo River traveling through the clouds in a carriage pulled by 6 one-horned dragons. Sorry, I had to cut that part of the picture off to show you the back part in detail. But you can just see the goddess sitting in her carriage, while behind trail another 2 dragons with a single horn. And what are those red curlicues? Who knows? Wings? Well, a creature that resembles a Makara appears to be threatening her carriage. So there's a dragon and a Makara. So how did that work? And what about the carp? Described as inseparably linked to the dragon. Not only was it said that they share the same aquatic habitat, but the dragon has the power to transform itself into a carp, and of course, vice versa. That's the best known story. And the complex relationship between those two has got lots of legends behind it. And the best known of which is the classic story of the carp, which if it manages to swim up the Lungmen River, notice Lungmen, Dragon River, Dragon Gate River, and pass an obstacle, the Dragon Gate, can turn into a dragon. So now look at that vase on the right. That is in a Bauer Foundation, the Bauer Foundation Museum in Switzerland. And the curator, after studying it for a long time, decided that this proves the one fable that tells how a carp can only turn into a dragon if it's struck by a bolt of lightning. And the reason given is look at the radiance in the eyes. And the curator says not only that, but look at the neck of the vase. There's a number of tiny, tiny little dragons which have not completely transformed yet. They're waiting for their bolts of lightning. And scattered about the body are hundreds of tiny little carp who are still waiting their turn to even get up that river. So just what the scholars think is going on here, you're going to find lots of motifs and lots of different explanations. But that classic story appears over and over again, and you see it here on the brush pot on the left. And carp, they are especially lucky because they're also obviously fish, and thus they're auspicious because the word for fish also has a homophone that means abundance, hence their popularity on everything from rice bowls to Chinese New Year prints. And moreover, their color is gold, so how auspicious is that? Can't get more auspicious. And another little mystery. What is that little orb that's sometimes being chased by the dragon? Sometimes it's clutched by the dragon. Sometimes it's in the dragon's mouth. It's traditionally been described as a flaming pearl, but what is it really? What does it symbolize? Some scholars say wisdom, others say enlightenment, some say it's spiritual energy. Some say it's the moon, and it goes back to when it was tied into the seasons of the year, representing eclipses when swallowed by the dragon. Now that goes way back to Neolithic times, but it makes very good sense when you think about it. And the return of illumination back into the universe as the seasons change. But most scholars are sticking to pearl until we know better, so you can choose the interpretation that you like the best. So at present, if we were going to try to sum up the evolution of the Chinese dragon, I think we can say that in its oldest form, it represented a large range of those powerful and awesome, not understood forms of nature encountered by many early cultures, whether it was storms or floods or snakes or alligators, things to be respected, things that had power. So much power that using the image or their image could even be a protective talisman against lesser threats. So it's definitely something to think about. And then ceremonies would be added, prayers, maybe sacrifices, such as food. But as the centuries passed, changes, first initiated by the demise of the Shang dynasty, and later by all those external foreign influences from the northern plains, hot, dry cultures, together with the rise of China's philosophical schools, especially Confucius, who stresses social harmony, balance, and then the entrance of science and scientific knowledge, the dragon's mystique and mystery begins to soften. Their image still conveys their potential power, and that image continues even today, albeit in more symbolic and sometimes even more humorous and political roles, as you see here. So yes, here there are dragons, and there were 101 in today's presentation, all wishing you a glorious and happy New Year of the Dragon. Thank you. I'll leave that.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful. How we go from, you know, you've taken us dragons from all over the world, and from the beginning to now. Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor?
I doubt I could answer them. You would need 100 scholars of everything from archaeology to numerology. You cannot believe how many people have spoken out on the components of dragons and their thoughts about the origins, globally. And one interesting little tidbit I want to mention to you, you do a little bit of research and you think, okay, maybe 1 or 2 people will notice this. But 13 years ago, when I wrote my book on Chinese symbols, I did a little piece about the swastika. And I said somewhere in there has to be some sort of numerology that makes sense. And 2 days ago, I got an email from an Arab scholar who did his PhD dissertation on the number theory behind the ancient symbol of the swastika, and wrote to thank me because it was what he read in my book that inspired him to take that as his subject for his PhD dissertation. So you never know what little bit of information you find, what it can mean to others. So keep learning.
This is more it's not a question, a little bit of information. I have a feeling that, have a look at Google and look up, because I think there are horned vipers in this part of the world that have quite prominent spike on their head.
I had somebody argue with me about the caterpillars and slugs, but I just couldn't imagine a culture being terrified of a slug or caterpillar.
The vipers are very poisonous.
Horned vipers. It could well be. Because there's definitely something on the dragon's head. So it's not just a snake, is it? It's not a snake, no. Anyone else?
Vipers are snakes. Vipers are snakes. They're poisonous snakes. So there are horned snakes. I Look it up.
Okay, okay. I always thought snakes and vipers were two different categories. I had someone trying to tell me alligators and crocodiles were the same. No. No.
Vipers are a snake.
Oh, okay. Thank you. See, I'm not a zoologist either. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And thank you all of those who wore red, because you're really in the spirit of the Chinese New Year. And I think it's great fun that you made the effort. So thank you for coming.